Let's get started. Over here, we are. Hi, Sheldon.
Bernard, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, we are in Daf Samach Vav Amud Sheni, like 12 lines from the bottom, and we're up to the middle of the sugya Amar Rab Moni Bar Patish. I just want to point out something I thought fascinating, and I maybe you might feel the same way. You see, our Gemara is dealing with this story that the Brisa brought down, that the president, the Bnei B'Seira, they were the Nesiim. They were like the Gadol Hadar. And they didn't know what the din would be if Pesach comes out, Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos. Do you bring the korban Pesach? Does it push away Shabbos or not? They didn't know. It seems that they didn't know what we take for granted that it's written in the Mishnah that it does. The great Gedolim didn't know. And so they were troubled by, or maybe they did know, but they didn't know what the source was. And then along comes Hillel, who comes from Bavel, and he says that because I serve Shmai and Atalion, I know that it does, and I know the source. And what the greatness about the intellectual honesty of these Gedolim at that time, these are Tanoim. These are not, these are greater than the earliest Tanoim. They stepped down from their position and they said that you take over because you must be greater than us. And that's how we got into this sugya of, and then Hillel took over and he became the Nasi. I guess Shammai, his nemesis, came the Av Bezdin. But Hillel became the Nasi, and then he was being a little bit showing superiority by saying that the reason why he's been chosen to be the Nasi is because he served Shmai V'Talion. You were lazy, and you didn't serve Shmai V'Talion. And then the Gemara tells us that he himself forgot a halacha. He didn't know what the din would be, as if can you bring the knife in the animal. So it's quite fascinating. So the Gemara got through saying that if you have a little bit of gaiva, if you show a little bit of haughtiness, no matter what, you lose your wisdom. And now the Gemara was talking about not only if you show haughtiness, but if you get a little angry, you lose your wisdom. And here's where we begin. The Gemara is talking about the results of what happens if someone gets angry. Amar Rab Moni Bar Patish. Rab Moni Bar Patish says, Kol Shekoyas, anybody who loses his temper. So Afilu Poiskin Olav Gedulah Min Hashemaim. Even if it was said upon this person that he's going to be, let's say, he's going to have a high position, as we'll see. Even if they made him to be the king, they pull him down. In other words, he won't get the job. That's what it says. How do you know that? We know it from Tanakh. Eliyav. Eliyav is who? David HaMelech's brother. Now, as you know, David was the youngest of many children, and his older brothers were great men. And during the war against the Plishtim, they were out there in the war facing Goliath. And as you know the story, so that David was asked by his father Yishai to bring some food to the people at the front line, so to speak. And so David came to bring food to his brother Eliyav. And Eliyav got angry at him and said, "What are you doing here? You just coming to see the war. You're not interested. You're not helpful here. So get lost." He got angry at why David HaMelech showed up to the war. And in the end, as you know, Shaul HaMelech was making a big reward to whoever would go fight Goliath. He'll give his daughter Michal as a wife. So this Eliyav tells his brother David, Shenema, Vayicha af Eliyav b'David. Eliyav got angry at David. Why'd you come here? Valmina Tashta, who did you leave? What did you bring? Ma'at Soin Ha'henav Abinba. Ani Yadati, I know as Zadoincha, as Royal Levavecha. I know your intentions and the evil in your heart. Ki laman ro'is hamilchama yoradta. You came to see the war. You're not helpful. You're just a bystander, and you come in to make problems. Fine. Many years later, Shmuel Hanavi was asked to go to the house of Yishai and choose one of his kids to be the king. And he almost chose Eliyav because Eliyav was such a great person. It was such a minute moment of anger, and in fact, Eliyav was supposed to be king. When Shmuel wanted to anoint the Bekulu Ksiv, when Shmuel asked God, "Is it this boy of Yishai?" and God said, "No, it's not this one." When he came to Eliyav, it says, "Ksiv, v'yayma Hashem el Shmuel, al tabit el mar'eu val govoya kamosei." Don't look at his look and his height. He ma'astihu. God was disgusted with him. In other words, it's mashma that God really chose him, but he pushed him away once he became angry. So in other words, the real king was supposed to be Eliyav, but because he displayed temper against David, so therefore he lost the position. Mechlal, that God wanted him until that moment where he got angry at David, he was really destined to be the next king, and the Malchus based Eliyav. Now it's known as Malchus based David. You see the high standards to be a Melech HaYisrael, that you can't show any display of anger. The Gemara continues. We learned before that the Korban Pesach overrides Shabbos. That we learned before. But we also know a din that the Korban Pesach would override Tumah. What that means is that if Gans Klal Yisrael was Tameh, then the people would still be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Not by every Tumah. It only applies by Tamei Mace. If every Jew was, for whatever reason, Tamei Mace, then we would still bring the Korban Pesach B'Tumah, because Pesach overrides Tumah. So the Gemara says, Ashkachan Tamid uPesach B'Dachi Shabbos. I know for a fact that the Korban Tamid and the Korban Pesach override Shabbos. The Dachu Tumah Menolam. How do you know that they override Tumah? That means if Klal Yisrael was Tameh, you would still bring the Korban Tamid and you bring a Korban Pesach. Amrei, so they answered, Pesach mitamed le'inyan Shabbos. Just like you learned before that the Korban Pesach is override Shabbos. How do you know the Korban Pesach override Shabbos? You learned it from Tamid, because there was a Gzeira Shava moyadoi b'mayadoi. Hachinami. So the source teaching that Tamid overrides Shabbos is the source teaching that it overrides Shabbos is from Tamid. Because Tamid, it says, Oila Shabbat b'Shabbatoi aloyos Tamid. And Korban Pesach is learned from Tamid. But it works the other way. Hachinami also, Yalef Tamid b'Pesach le'inyan Tumah. You learn out Korban Tamid, learn something from Pesach le'inyan Tumah. That just like Korban Pesach overrides Tumah, Korban Tamid would also override Tumah. Now the question is, Pesach Gufu Manolan. How do you know Korban Pesach overrides Tumah? Where do you see that? Amar Rabbi Yochanan to Amakro, because this is a pasuk. Ish. This pasuk is written by the Pesach Sheni, and it says Ish ki yatame lenafesh. Any person that had a tumah on his, he became tameh because he touched the dead body, and he couldn't bring the Pesach Rishon, he brings the Pesach Sheni. So the darshan Ish nitcha Pesach Sheni. If only one person was Tameh, he gets pushed to do a Pesach Sheni. Ve'ein Tzibur nitchen Pesach Sheni. But a Tzibur doesn't get pushed off to Pesach Sheni. If the whole Tzibur was Tameh, they would still bring a Pesach during the first time in Nisan. And La'avdei B'Tumah, they do it in Tumah. So that was the source learning of where you know that the Tzibur, even if it's Tameh, would still bring a Korban Pesach. And that will remain in the Maskanas of Gemara, the Limud. But the Gemara asks a question on that. Amalei Resh Shimon ben Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Resh Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, why can't you say that the pasuk gets a drush like this? Ema ish nitchela Pesach Sheni. Only one person gets pushed off the Pesach Sheni. Tzibur lesli takati loy Pesach Rishon loy Pesach Sheni. A tzibur that's tamei. There's no way to rectify it. They'll never bring a Korban Pesach. You could darshan it that way. Only an individual has a chance to bring a Pesach Sheni. A tzibur can never bring a Pesach Sheni, and they don't bring Pesach Shrishin. So what is the source? Elam Rab Shakish, Rab Shimon Lakish says, here's the source. Now, here's the pasuk that you know. I just want to review it with you. Take a look here. You have three camps in the Jewish people. Shechina, let's say, was where the Beis Hamikdash was. Machne Levi was where the Har HaBayis was, the Mount Temple Mount, and Yisrael was the rest of the city of Jerusalem. Okay? Now, the halacha is the following: if someone is a tamei, he can't go into the Beis Hamikdash. So if he was tamei with a sheretz, or he touched a dead body, or a goy, cannot go into the Beis Hamikdash. He can only be in Shevet Levi, in the Machne Leviah, the Levium camp. If you're a zav, or a person is a balkari, so then he can't go even on the Har HaBayis. He had to be in the city of Jerusalem, but cannot go on the Temple Mount. A Metzora was the most strict of Tumah, and he has to be outside the walled city. He has to be outside the city of Jerusalem. As we know, Metzora gets thrown out because of his big avera of speaking ill, lashon hara, whatever. So he says, the pasuk says, the Torah doesn't tell you where you put everybody, but we have drushes. You have to send away from the camp, kol tzurua, anybody who is a Metzora, v'chol zav, v'chol tamei lenefesh, anybody who touched a dead body. So the Gemara says, yoyme tamei mesim, v'al yoyme zavin u'metzoraim. Tamei meis is the most easiest of the tumah, right? I'll explain to you a reason, but the Gemara is going to say that the reason is a tamei meis touched an outer source, and that's how it becomes tamei. A zav or metzora are types of tumah that emanate from within a person. So a tamei meis, if the Torah wants to tell you that a tamei meis cannot go into the Beis Hamikdash, why does the Torah tell you that all these types of tumah can't go into the Beis Hamikdash? Just tell me a tamei meis can't go into the Beis Hamikdash, and I will know if a tamei meis, which is the lightest tumah, can't go into the Beis Hamikdash. Certainly a zav and mitzorin can't go into the Beis Hamikdash. Yoyme tamei meis, meisim val yoyme zav and mitzorin. But ani yoyme, I would say, im tamei meisim mishtachin zav and mitzorin like kolshkein. Certainly a zav and mitzorin can't go into the Beis Hamikdash. If a tamei meis can't go into the Beis Hamikdash, certainly a zav and mitzorin. Samazayin amaral. Ella, the Torah teaches you that the Torah is telling you that there's most of the time, a tamei meis cannot go into the Beis Hamikdash. That's true, but there is an opportunity that a tamei meis will be allowed to go into the Beis Hamikdash, and a zav and mitzora will not be allowed to go. El yesh lechasha shezavin umitzora mishtalchem when the ain tamei meis mishtalchem. There's a time in a period where you will send away a zav and mitzora from the Beis Hamikdash, but a tamei meis is not going to be sent away from the Beis Hamikdash. What's that? Pesach haba betumah. When most of the tzibur is tamei b'meis, they make a Pesach with tumah. And a zav and mitzora, if everybody in Klal Yisrael was a zav and mitzora, they wouldn't make a carbon Pesach. Only if we're all tamei meisim, and that's what the pasuk teaches you. Amar Abaya said, where do you know this from? Because the Torah did not have to write tamei meis. The tamei meis seems to be, the Torah didn't have to write zavim u'matzoran. It just could have written tamei meis. If that's the case, the Torah didn't have to write the word zavim either. The Torah could have just written tamei meis. Why did the Torah write zavim as well? And if I would know that if a zav and tamei meis are certainly a mitzora. Amar Abaye hachi lemenami yoyma zav u'tamei meis. Let the Torah write a zav and a tamei meis have to leave the Beis Hamikdash. Val yoyma mitzora, and not say mitzora. Va'ani oimen, and I will say zav mishtalech. If a zav gets sent out, mitzora like kolshkim. So why does the Torah write the word zav? That's the question. And elam, it must be that there's a time that the zav will not be sent away. El yesh lecha sha'a shemitzaroi mishtalchim vein zavin utmei meis mishtalchim ve'ezazeh Pesach haba b'tumah. What the Gemara wants to say now, if based on your logic, I could say the same thing, that just like the Torah says extra words of Mitzorah, the Mitzorah, it's not necessary to say the word Mitzorah because it says the word Tmei Mesim and Zav. So why did the Torah write the word Mitzorah? Maybe it's coming to teach you that a Pesach that has everybody in Klal Yisrael is a Zav, they would still have to bring up a carbon Pesach. And so the Gemara says, just like you said that by Tmei Meis, that when everybody's a Tmei Meis, you have to bring a carbon Pesach. Why don't you say the same thing, that when every Jew is a Zav, you still have to bring the carbon Pesach? The Chitema Hachinami, will you say that is true? That if a Jew is a Zav, if all the Jews are Zavs, you could still bring a carbon Pesach? But now we know it's not true. The Mishnah says, Pesach haba'al betuma, lo yoichle memenu, a Pesach that's brought in Tumah, it's only if it's brought in as a Tmei Meis. Lo yoichle memenu zavim, v'zavos nidus v'yoldos, v'im achlu peturim. If they did eat, they're potter. But it says lo yoichlu, that there's no heter when Klal Yisrael brings a carbon Pesach betuma for a Zav to eat the carbon Pesach. So the way you, Rish Lakish, are darshaning the pasuk cannot mean to teach you that a Pesach is Pesach that is everybody's tamei would override the Pesach overrides tumah, because that will tell you that not only it overrides Tmei Meis, it should override Zav, and we know that's not the case. Ella, so where do you know, basically, where the Gemara is holding now, is where would I know the pasuk that teaches me that Pesach overrides only what type of tumah? A Tmei Meis. Ella Marbaya, you know it, La'ola Mikra Kama. You know it from the very first pasuk. Very first pasuk that says, Ish Kiyeh Tamei L'Nefesh, you have to bring a Pesach Sheni. So we darshan like this, In Kain, Nichtiv Rachamona, Ish Kiyeh Tamei. Every person that is Tamei, if you're Tamei, bring a Pesach Sheni. Lo Nefesh Lo Mali. Why does the Torah have to tell you that if you're Tamei for a dead body, you bring a Pesach Sheni? Maybe the Torah gives you the right to bring a Pesach Sheni, even if you were Tamei, you touched the sherets, or you touched or you're a Zav. You could bring a Pesach Sheni if you become pure at that time. So why does the Torah only say the example of Lenefesh that you touched the dead body? Don't say, the Gemara says, are you going to say, Hi Lenefesh, Lahachiyadas, it's coming to teach you, Hatmei Meis hu de Nitchel Pesach Sheni. Only a Tmei Meis gets pushed away to Pesach Sheni. Aval Shar Tmeim Loy, but no other Tumah gets pushed away to a Pesach Sheni. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Lo Yehu Oisim Pesach Sheni, Ela Tmei Meisem, Vishahoya B'derech Rechoyka, Zavim U'Mitzrayim Boil Nides Menayin, Tamid Loime Ish. In other words, I know for a fact that if a person is a Zav, Mitzorah, he would also have the right to bring a Pesach Sheni if he becomes pure by then. Because the Torah says, Ish, no matter what Tameh you have, no matter what, the extra word Ish tells you no matter what Tameh you are, if you're pure by Pesach Sheni, you can bring a Pesach Sheni. So why does the Torah say, only use the example of Lo Nefesh, the Kosev Rachmana Lamali? The Torah says only if you become Tameh for touching a dead body, you can bring a Pesach Sheni. I know from the drasha that it doesn't mean only a dead body. It means any type of tumah can bring a Pesach Sheni. So why does the Torah say Lo Nefesh? Alihachi Kama. Ish Nitchel Pesach Sheni. Only an individual can bring a Pesach Sheni. Ve'ein Tzibcha Nitchel Pesach Sheni. A tzibah doesn't get pushed off to do a Pesach Sheni. Avdei B'tumah, they do it in Tumah. So Pesach, if Klal Yisrael is Tameh, it overrides the Tumah and they bring a Pesach. They bring the carbon Pesach. But what only type of Tumah? Only if they're Tameh Meis, but not other types of Tumah. When did the Tzibor does a Pesach Rishon B'tumah? Only if everybody's B'tumah Meis. Avashar Tumas Loi Avdi. But if they're Tameh in any other way, they don't do a Pesach. They don't do the Pesach Rishon. So where we're holding right now, and this is the end of the sugya. We know that if someone were to ask you, can Pesach override Tumah? The answer is yes. It depends which Tumah. It overrides if the tzibur was Tamei Mace, but if they have any other Tumah, it would not override the Tumah. And where do we know that from? Because we know the Torah says, Ish kiyeh tamei lenefesh, and the word lenefesh is extra. The word lenefesh by Pesach Sheni is extra. Teaches you only a yachid who is a tamei mace on Pesach Rishon, he has the opportunity to bring a Pesach Sheni. But a tzibur that is tamei lenefesh, they don't have to wait to Pesach Sheni. If the whole tzibur is tamei lenefesh, they can bring the Pesach Rishon. And that is basically what the svara of a lot of people who say that even today we could potentially bring a carbon Pesach, even Bisman Hazeh, because just the fact that you can't find, we don't have the Paraduma waters, doesn't mean you can't bring the carbon Pesach. We just learned in the Gemara that even if Klal Yisrael is Tamei Mace, you could still bring the Pesach, the carbon Pesach. Do you need the Beis Hamikdash to bring the carbon Pesach? It's not really so. If you know where the Mizbeach was, technically, there is a lot of responsa written to prove that potentially Bisman Hazeh, it would be possible to bring a carbon Pesach on the Har HaBayis today. Anyway, new Gemara. Amar Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda said, now, just to remember that a Metzora has to stay outside the walled city of Jerusalem. What happens if the Metzora walked into Jerusalem? Does he get Malchus? It says he has to stay outside. It says, Lo Yatamu Machaneya. So would he get Malchus? Amar Rav Chizda says a tremendous chiddush. A Metzora that goes into the walled city, Potter, he doesn't have to bring a carbon. He doesn't get liable, doesn't get lashes. Shnema Boded Yeshiv b'chutz l'machane moishavai. Boded Yeshiv levadai b'chutz l'machane moishavai. That the Torah tells you that he has to sit alone, and from outside the camp, that's where he should stay. The Torah hakosav nitkoy lasei. The Torah connects it to an asay. We know that a lav that has an assay right after it. For example, the Torah says, "Don't shout, not steal," but if you steal, return it. So you don't get malchus for that lav. So here, the Torah gave you a lav that the Torah should not be betama the machna by entering it, but then it gave you an essay, which is a mitzvah assay that if he does go into the camp, he has to go back outside and sit alone. So the Torah gave you a way to rectify the lav in order that you don't get malchus. Therefore, Rav Chizda said, a Metzora that breaks through his mechitza and goes into the camp, he will not get malchus. We just tell him, go outside and rectify the avera that you did and sit back outside the walled city. But a Zav and a Balkari or all the others, if they walk into the camp, they would get malchus because there's no assay associated with their lav. So the Gemara says, Esaveh. We learned in the Brisa, Metzora that goes and breaks through his mechitza, he gets lashes, 40. So we see a Metzora does get lashes. And this is a nice point. A Tamei Mace is allowed to go into Har HaBayis, Machna Leviyah. If someone is not only touched a dead body, he's allowed to go on the Har HaBayis. Loi Tamei Mace Movad Amru. Not only a Tamei Mace, Elafil Mace Atzme, a corpse you're allowed to bring on Har HaBayis. Why? Because it's this week's Parsha. Shenama, it says in the Pasuk, Vayikach Moshe, Atam Moshe Yosef Imai. Moshe was carrying the bones of Yosef when they left Mitzrayim. Imai b'mechitzase, it stayed with Moshe. Where was Moshe? Moshe was always in the Machne Leviyah. And you see, he was carrying a corpse. So we see that a corpse is allowed to be a Machne Leviyah. But the point here is, the Brisa said beferish that a Metzora, if he goes and breaks through to come into the city, he gets 40 lashes. So how did Rav Chizda say you putter? The Gemara says Tanoihi. It actually is a machlokes Tanoim, and that's why Rav Chizda said is according to one opinion, because the time we learned in the Brisa, but that this Brisa teaches you where all the different tumas get set up. Where are they permitted to go in? Which camp are they permitted to go into? The Tanya, we learned to the Brisa, Bada Yeshev, Levada Yeshev Shlei, Tamei Machen Yoshim Imay. By the Mitzvah, it says sit alone. That teaches you that he has to sit outside the city and nobody's allowed to be around him. I might think a Zav and Tmei Meis all are sent into one place, that wherever a Zav can go or a Tmei Meis can go, both can be in the same camp. Talmud loima lo yitamos machanehem. They shouldn't be mitama each their respective machnas, their respective camps. Litin machnazeh machnazeh divrei Yehuda. It teaches you that a Zav has its own special restrictions and a Tmei Meis has special restrictions, divrei Yehuda, which means that a Zav could only go into Machne Yisrael, but he's not allowed to go into Machne Leviyah. A Tomei Lenefesh is allowed to go into Machne Leviyah, but cannot go into Machne Shechina, because that's so. Therefore, that's how you learn the separate entities of where people are allowed to go. But the point is that the Rabbi Yehuda used the pasuk of Bodei Yeshev to teach you where a Mitzvah could go. So he's not extra to be a nitek la'aseh, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda will hold that a Mitzvah that breaks through and goes into Machne Yisrael, he would get Malchus. But Rab Shimon Omer ain't a tzarech. I don't need the pasuk of Bodei Yeshev. That's extra. How do I know that Mitzvah has its own camp? Harei Omer, it says in the pasuk, "Vishalchu min amachna kol tzrua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lenefesh." So, l'chayra, we had this before. Yomer tmei meis. Let it just say that a tmei meis has to leave the camp. Ba'al yomer tmei zav, and don't tell me about a zav. If they're all supposed to be in the same camp, and you're telling me get out of the Beis Hamikdash, so let the Torah just write that a tmei meis has to leave the Beis Hamikdash. And certainly I will know a Tamei Zav has to leave the Beis Hamikdash. Vani Oima, I will say, if Tamei Meis Nishalkin, if you have to send a Tamei Meis out of the Beis Hamikdash, Zavim Lekolshke. Loma Nem Azav. Why does the Torah say a Zav has to be thrown out of the Beis Hamikdash? If it's Tamei Meis, certainly a Zav. So Litin Loy Machne Shia. It's coming to teach you that a Tamei Meis gets pushed out of the Beis Hamikdash onto Harabayis. A Zav cannot be on the Temple Mount. He has to be thrown out a little bit further than the Tmei Meis. And now we go with take it the third step. The Yomer Zav al Yomer Mitzorah. Vadi Yomer, if Zav and Mishtalchem, Mitzorah and Kolshkem. If the Zav and Mitzorah can be in the same camp, then let the Torah just write a Zav gets thrown out of the Beis Hamikdash and thrown off Harabayis and could be in Jerusalem. But if the Zav can do that, then certainly a Mitzorah, because Mitzorah is more stricter than a Zav. So why does the Torah write Mitzorah? It teaches you that Mitzvah has to be even more stricter, thrown out of all three camps. That he gets pushed away from all three camps. And the Mitzvah has to be out here, outside. The Zav is about here, the Machne Yisrael, and which is the Jerusalem. And Tmei Nefesh can be in Machne Leviyah, but nobody can be in Machne Shechina. Now, so according to Reb Shimon, I don't need Bodei Yeshev to teach you where the Zav, where the Mitzvah should be. I don't need it because I learned it from somewhere else. So according to Reb Shimon, that Bodei Yeshev is extra to give you an essay to teach you that if Mitzvah breaks through the camp and breaks through, so he doesn't get Malchus because he has a way to rectify the lav. How does he rectify the lav? It's like somebody who steals. What do you tell him? Return it. Same thing. If he broke through Machne Yisrael, he broke into the camp, we tell him, now you have a mitzvah to say to rectify the Aveira that you did, go back out, and therefore you're not going to get Malchus. Now, the Gemara brings a new thing. My chumra d'zav mitmei meis. The whole thing is predicated based on saying that a tmei meis is a lighter tumah than zav. Why would I say that? Tmei meis, zav, both have to wait 7 days, but Tmei Meis seem to be like a more chumradik type of tumah, because you have to have sprinkling of the waters. So Gemara said, no, shekain tumah yaitza olav magufa. A zav, the tumah emanates from his body, and therefore a zav gets thrown out of more camps than the Tmei Meis. How do you know that? Adarabba, Tmei Meis chomer. A Tmei Meis is much more stricter. Shekain toin azar shlish vid. In order to make a Tmei Meis tahar, you have to sprinkle the paraduma waters on the 3rd and the 7th day. So what makes a zav much stricter type of tumah than a tmei mace? Amakra, the answer is that a zav is not more stricter than a tmei mace, but it's certainly more stricter than a balkari, because amakra tmei, the chol tmei, the rabbis tmei sheretz. I'm sorry, that the chol tmei is marba a tmei sheretz, the zav chame mitmei sheretz. In this picture, you see that not only the Torah say that a tmei nefesh goes out of the Beis Hamikdash, but the Torah from the chol tmei have to leave the Beis Hamikdash, means that that even if you touch a sheretz, you leave the Beis Hamikdash. So a zav is much more stricter than a sheretz, and therefore, why did the Torah have to write v'chol that even a sheretz has to leave the Beis Hamikdash? If once the Torah wrote sheretz, you don't have to write zav. So it must teach you that zav has to leave 2 camps. That's what it says, because certainly a zav chama mitmei sheretz. A zav is more chumer dek than a sheretz. By chumrah, what makes a zav more chumer than somebody who touched the sheretz? The amram, because the zav actually the tumah emanated from his body. A sheretz actually comes from an outside source, and therefore a zav is much more chumer dek than a sheretz. So the Gemara says, Adarabba, just the opposite. Sheretz chomer shekei metama ba'onis. Listen to this. If you touch a sheretz, even if it's by accident, you touch a dead lizard, right, or dead weasel, even if it's by accident, you become tamei. A zav, the only time you can become tamei with a zav, and I remind you what a zav is. A zav is a seminal discharge that's like a sickly seminal discharge, and we darshan from Sukkim that if you have any reason why you have this seminal discharge, either you're sick or you ate the wrong foods or you were doing exercise, you don't become tamei. So we see that zav has a weakness to it that you don't become tamei if it was an oinus, if it was not your fault that you had this discharge. So the Gemara says no. Amrei. So we turn to base. That even sometimes a zav could also become tamei if it's not your fault. You could still become a zav even if it's not your fault. The first time you have that seminal discharge, that sickly discharge, it's metama ba'onis. You would still, even if it's not your fault, you still become tamei, albeit you don't have to wait 7 days, but you're still called a zav. If you have 2 seminal discharge, you have to wait 7 days. And if you have these 3 types of discharges, then you have to bring a carbon. But the first time, it doesn't matter whether it was your fault or not your fault, you'll still become a zav. So in that way, a zav is just as strict as a zav is just as strict as a sheretz. So therefore, doesn't matter. Sheretz has nothing over zav. Zav is always more stricter than sheretz because the tumah comes from within. So therefore, zav is more chumradik than sheretz, and therefore, if sheretz is only thrown out of the Beis Hamikdash, zav must be thrown out 1 step further, and it must not be allowed to be on Har HaBayis. It must be Har HaBayis is off limits for a zav. It could only be around the city of Jerusalem in Machne Yisrael. Now the Gemara asks a question: My chumer de mitzorim zav. What makes more chumerdik mitzora over a zav? Why did you say that mitzora should be thrown out of everything, and a zav could be in Har HaBayis, but not in the base, not in Jerusalem? A zav could walk around Jerusalem, but a mitzora have to be thrown out of Jerusalem. What makes mitzora more stricter? Because we see shekain toim priya or prima, a mitzora has to grow his hair, and also has to rip his clothing, and he's also betash b'shamit. He's not allowed to be with his wife. So mitzora has much more stricter laws. So therefore, mitzora has to be thrown out of a much more all the machnos. Adarabah, just the opposite. Zav chamer, zav is more stricter. Shekain etama mishka v'moshev, a zav. Interesting thing about a zav is if he sits on a bed or a chair, right? That chair, even though the zav is an avatuma, even if the zav sat on a chair and walked away, that chair is an avatuma. So that if somebody touches that chair, right, not only does he become tamei, the clothing that he is wearing become tamei. That doesn't exist by a mitzora. A mitzora that sits on a chair, yes, indeed, makes the chair tamei, but the person that touches that chair is not like an avatuma, that his clothing become tamei, only he becomes tamei. So we have a strictness in zav over mitzora. Umatame kli cheres behesed. And a mitzav, if it just moves a kli cheres, let's say it takes a stick and just moves a earthenware keli, it becomes tamei. A mitzora that does that, it doesn't become tamei. So there are strictnesses by zav that do not exist by mitzora. So who's to tell you that a mitzora is more stricter of a tumah than to zav? Amakra, no, you're right. Mitzora is not stricter than a zav. But the Torah also said that a balkari is someone, a balkari is thrown out of the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore he is the same on par with the zav. And certainly a mitzora is more chumradik than a balkari. Omakra zav v'chol zav l'rabes balkari. Again, the balkari, the zav may not be, the mitzora may not be more stricter than the zav. The mitzora is certainly more stricter than the balkari. So why does the Torah have to tell, why did the Torah have to write zav if it wrote a balkari? If a balkari gets thrown out of the camps, why does the Torah write mitzora? To teach you that a mitzora is one step stricter than a balkari, that it's even thrown out of all three camps. So the Gemara asked, "Umay chumre? What is the chumradik over mitzora of a balkari?" Simple. Kida Amr, like we said before, although mitzora and balkari both have tumas emanating from their body, a mitzora has much more stricter that it has priya, prima, and asa b'tashim sumita. It means you rip their clothing and they have to let the hair hang and roll along, and they're not allowed to be with their wives. So the Gemara says, Adeb Rabba, a balkari. Now, balkari is somebody with a normal seminal discharge, right? Balkari chomer, shekei metame b'mashu. A balkari is tamei because even a drop of semen that comes out, it becomes tamei. And a mitzora, when do they become tamei? Only if the white splotch is the size of a dime or geris. So it has to be a certain size. A balkari has no shear to it, no shear for it for becoming tamei. And a mitzora, you have to wait till it has a shear. So we see that a balkari has a strictness over a mitzora. And so the Gemara, no. Savalak Rab Nosson, that this Tana holds like Rab Nosson, that even a balkari has a shear. Tanya, Rab Nosson, Oimem, Mishum Rab Shmuel, Zov Tzorach Kachasimus Pia Ama. You have to have enough of semen that closes up the urethra. So there is a shear for balkari, and there is a shear for mitzora. So therefore, balkari has no chumrah over mitzora. Mitzora has more chumras over a balkari. It has all these priya, prima, and asa b'tashim samita. Therefore, if the Torah says extra words that a mitzora has to be thrown out of the camp, it means to tell you that a mitzora has to be thrown out of the camp even more than a balkari. And if a balkari is thrown out of the machna levia, and it could only be in machna Yisrael, then a mitzora has to be somewhere else, completely out, which is he has to be in machna outside the camp, outside the city walls. Now the Gemara says, "V'chol tsurua lamali." Why does the Torah write "v'chol tsurua"? What's that coming to be marba? There's no other tumah after mitzora. That's the highest point. Because of kol zav, since the Torah wrote the word kol zav, because it's nami kol tsurua, there's a word kol tsurua to be marba. That's something, but it doesn't really teach you anything. Kol tsurua doesn't be marba anything. So again, what we just were teaching you over here, that what we just learned is the different tumas. What camps are they going? What camps are they thrown out of? What camps can't they be in? The easiest one is tamei meis. The second one is zav, and the third one, the most strictest, is mitzora. And you learned it out from pasuk that says that the Torah just writes, send them away from the camp. Kol tzurua, v'chol zav, v'chol tamei lenefesh. So the Torah wrote those three words, kol, and it teaches you that mitzora is the most strictest. It gets thrown out of all three camps. Zav is thrown out of two camps, and tamei lenefesh is only thrown out of mashach and shechina, but it could be in the second camp, machna levia. So that seems like a nice drasha to learn from this pasuk of where Rabbi Yehuda, where Rav Shimon learned all this thing, he learned it from one pasuk, and that's why Badad is extra for him. Now the Gemara, this is one final point. Rabbi Huda, Shapeh, Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon's had a very nice way to learn out the three different camps, from that pasuk. So therefore, he doesn't need Badad. But Rabbi Huda, why didn't you learn like Rab Shimon? Rab Shimon has a nice, smooth way of learning the three different camps for these three different tumas. And for the Gemara, I need that pasuk of Yishalchum and a machna called Tzruah, called Zav, called Tmei Nefesh to teach you another interesting din. Let me throw out the question to you. The question would be: it's time that everybody is a Tmei Mace, and therefore everybody is bringing their carbon Pesach. What happens? As I told you before, a Zav and Mitzorah are not allowed to bring their carbon Pesach, right? Because everybody's bringing it with Tumah, it's only if you're Tmei Mace you can bring it B'Tumah, not if you're a Zav and Mitzorah. So the Gemara says, what happens if a Zav during that time pushed himself in, went to the Azara, and brought his carbon Pesach? He didn't tell anybody he was a Mitzorah, he didn't tell everybody he's a Zav, and while everybody was bringing their carbon B'Tumah, B'Tmei Mace, he brought a carbon Pesach B'Tumah while he's a Zav. Would he be Mechayev? Would it be Mechayev Malkus or Karis? The Gemara says, Rab Lezer Omer, that he wouldn't be. Rab Lezer Omer, Yochel Dachaku Zav Mitzrayim V'Nichnusu Lazar B'Pesach Haba B'Tumah. Yochel Yehu Chayavim. I think that they would be Mechayev, that they did a big Aveira if a Zav Mitzrayim brought up carbon Pesach, even though everybody else was bringing a carbon Pesach when they're Tmei Mace. Talmud Loima, they're not Chayev. You have to send them away all together, then there's a problem. When the Tmei Mace gets sent away from the Beis HaMikdash, Zav Mitzrayim Mishtalchem, then there's an Aveira for a Zav Mitzrayim to be in the Beis HaMikdash. But ain't Tmei Mace Mishtalchem, but at a time when the Tmei Mace are not sent away from the Beis HaMikdash, during the time when the carbon was brought, when the Rav Tzibor was a Tmei Mace, then if a Zav and Mitzorah pushed himself in and brought a carbon Pesach, he didn't do the lav. He didn't get the big Aveira yet. He shouldn't do it, but if he did it, he didn't do the Aveira, because at the end of the day, everybody is bringing their carbon B'Tumah. So what we learned today is two things. One, we learned the different camps, the different tumas get sent away from different camps, and we learned that Pesach, Korban Pesach, is doicha, override Tmei Mace, but it does not override Zav. And that's the 2 points that we learned in today's Daf Samach Zayin. Okay, and we learned a little bit about anger. That was the beginning. Okay, take care. Gute Nacht.
Have a good night.